אהבת עולם את ישראל עמך
Shabbat Shalom. Welcome, Bruchim Abbaim. I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi. You have found Beit Virtuali, and let's stir up a little Torah together. Today's stirring up of Torah acknowledges that some sermons simply cannot be given in a congregation. If Torah is a mirror to see a truer self for the purpose of elevation, then a drasha, devar Torah, sermon, speech, these are all the things that help us interpret what we see when we look in the mirror. As spiritual growth requires a bit of a sense of discomfort with the present, then sermons that reflect how the default present can tear communities apart aren't going to be very well received. All this really does have to do with the necessary part of ego development. As we become more aware of self, as opposed to self-aware, by necessity we develop a narrative in which we are the protagonist, most often the heroic protagonist. Our brains did not evolve to see our actions in a historically accurate fashion. That's simply an illusion from within our subjective narratives. You are irrational. You're just making stuff up. I, of course, see all events with the absolute historical accuracy of a GoPro. Of course we don't. And spiritual development essentially includes that realization and the navigation through that realization. Yet that may not even be the most fascinating aspect of how we tell our own stories in order to fool ourselves into interpreting our actions as those of the hero. One of our great illusions is that we carry the highest level of our achievement into every other aspect of our lives. I am a captain of industry. Of course I bring great gifts to the synagogue board of trustees. Hey, it works for rabbis too. I give a great sermon. Of course I bring penetrating wisdom into each moment of pastoral counseling. Of course, part of this is a response to the expectations of others. We fool ourselves, but only partially because we've evolved to fool ourselves. The rest is magnified by these same illusions that others hold for us. You are a great captain of industry. Of course, you will be a great asset to the synagogue board of trustees. You, rabbi, are a great public speaker. Of course, you will bring comforting presence to my moment of greatest despair. These narrative absurdities appear universally, and yet in certain contexts are seldom noticed. Most of us aren't going to assert, you are a captain of industry. Of course you can fly a fighter jet. Of course you are a great speaker from the pulpit, rabbi. I trust you in performing my brain surgery. And yet these skill set differences are as radically different as those between a public speaker and a therapist, a corporate CEO and an effective member of a synagogue board of trustees. And I'm imagining it's starting to dawn on all of us why this sermon can't be given in a synagogue, except that it needs to be given. Joseph seems to be the character in Torah that raises up this specific mirror and causes us this specific discomfort. And oh, how the Joseph narrative is filled with discomfort.
I look handsome, I look smart.
With Joseph, we are most implicitly forced to encounter the nature of the heroic narrative. For example, Torah is mostly the story of the relationship between the house of Israel and the eternal. Or if you want to leap a step deeper and get some extra psychological bonus points, the relationship between the house of Israel as an ideal and the inability for us as humans to live up to our ideals. As such, the house of Israel takes center stage in this drama, yet the concomitant parts seldom act heroically. At the beginning of the Joseph narrative, this is brutally demonstrated. Joseph is a spoiled brat. Jacob is blind, negligent, or both. And Joseph's brothers, well, all they do is engage in epic overreaction, throw their brother into a pit, sell him as a slave to a band of Ishmaelites. And then after a lot of yada yada yada, we end up now in Parashat Vayigash, where we begin with Judah pleading with Joseph, while not knowing that Joseph is Joseph, to not take Benjamin for a crime that Benjamin actually didn't commit, but instead was a setup by Joseph in order to... Did I mention that this narrative is incredibly complicated and impenetrable? And when read very carefully with Joseph in the role as literary hero, makes absolutely no sense. When we read Torah outside of the context of it being a mirror, instead see it as some kind of elevated fantasy novel, we can shrug our shoulders and impatiently flip through to the next story that we recognize a little bit more. Sure, Joseph does a lot of weird stuff, but he utters a Hallmark card version of spirituality as he reveals himself to his brothers that seems to ring true. Now do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me into slavery. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you. He repeats this as well at the end of Genesis with the more classic formulation, although you intended me harm, God meant it for good. Don't worry. It was all in God's plan that you threw me into a pit and sold me to slavers. How many roads to hell have been paved with these sentiments? Is what Joseph is saying wise, or do we only hear it as wise because it's coming from the mouth of the person who is at the heroic center of the narrative while standing in a position of power? Are quotes uttered by characters in the Tanakh meant to be the basis of religion, law, and spirituality? Or are they meant to cause us to look more deeply at the moments where we utter what we think to be wisdom and assume that they are religious truths? Now, back to our captain of industry and our great speaking rabbi. It is first necessary to recognize achievement in a positive and non-sarcastic way. If either of these hypothetical human beings rose to their various levels of success due to the merit of learning, hard work, and yes, ethical handling with everyone on their path to their high level of achievement, then it is also worth considering when we try to tear such people down. The larger narrative beyond this, however, is the subtle addition to this story that achievement in one area does not necessarily translate into accomplishment in another. Perhaps the best illustration is via the most biological of our various modalities of advancement: age. To put it absurdly, as we get older, we achieve age. Yay, now I'm 20. Yay, now I'm 65. Yay, where did the time go? Sometimes the modality that we might call wisdom is set right next to the modality of age. And as I'm getting older and have been graying for some time, I would like to believe that this is true. The very nature of the volume of collected experience seems to lead us to this conclusion, seems to lead us to the idea that age and wisdom are bound. We even have cliches that prove this. Yet the archetypally gray tribal patriarchs and matriarchs do not include everyone in the tribe that achieved advanced age, merely those that earned through the acquisition of actual wisdom the right to be called tribal elders. More bluntly, although age has the possibility, the potential to confer wisdom, this is not always a guarantee. When we look at achievement, we can probably map accomplishment onto quite a variety of scales. For example, vocational, avocational, spiritual, emotional, physical, intellectual, and wisdom. There must be a crossover, but as fantasy author Joel Rosenberg in the book The Sleeping Dragon once pointed out, as he was trying to describe the difference of wisdom and intelligence traits in a role-playing game. On the one side you have Richard Nixon, on the other side you have Edith Bunker. For slightly less gray-haired readers, you have Penny and Sheldon of Big Bang Theory fame. For all the critique that Big Bang Theory does get today, they nailed this dichotomy of IQ and EQ. As the embodiment of emotional wisdom, emotional intelligence, Penny never assumes herself to possess the IQ of Sheldon, while Sheldon, on the other hand, on many occasions assumes himself capable of possessing the sorts of wisdom to innately navigate through a situation, most of the time hilariously and horribly failing. High achievement on one scale does not equal high achievement on another. And problematically, the wisdom scale, along with aspects of the spirituality scale, are the only ones that contain the ability to understand this and to grasp the implications of not understanding this. Joseph achieves epically. He rises to a position of power in ancient Egypt second only to Pharaoh, who just happens to be the most powerful human being in that part of the world. So Joseph is like the second most powerful person in that part of the world. Not bad, considering. The Joseph narrative tells us implicitly through the prison drama that Joseph has continued developing his dreaming and dream interpretation skills, so let's call that avocation scale. And then second in command to Pharaoh? Well, this includes practical, political, and administrative organization, so let's call that vocational. Joseph is the original captain of industry. We might assume that in order to accomplish this, he also needed to have some people skills. But really, that would be an utterly false projection of our present reality into a radically different past. The second only to Pharaoh, if they needed to implement a plan, didn't need to convince people other than Pharaoh to do what he needed to do. Joseph would have had the literal power of life and death over those he ordered to carry out his plan. Seriously, read the entire Parashah and then read to the end of Genesis, and look at how many times Joseph's brothers were terrified, both before they knew he was Joseph and after they knew he was Joseph. It's sobering. And yet when Joseph spews cliched drivel like, you meant it for bad, but God meant it for good, we put it on banners and build religions around this pop wisdom. Joseph is not being held up in Torah at any point as a paragon of wisdom and spirituality. Dream interpretation is a skill that's developed. it's not the same as wisdom in this case. Being an effective leader contains an element of strategic thought, not a wise human who understands others. Rather than being held up as a paragon of wisdom and spirituality, I would argue that Torah actually argues the exact opposite. Joseph's actions are not those of a wise and spiritually elevated person. There is a certain survival wisdom that plays out. Yeah, he's dealing with brothers that threw him in a pit and sold him to slavers. Some of his actions can be seen through the lens of the necessity of ascertaining not only his brother's intentions, but as well to see if they had learned anything and had elevated themselves in the course of time over the type of people who would throw their brother in a pit and sell him to slavers. But can we read this and not just see a little bit of a powerful man playing with people that are finally in his clutches? A desire for revenge? A wish to play head games with people that had terribly wronged him? Put differently, is Joseph a human? Does he represent a human in this narrative? Us, as humans, can think of that relative who terribly wronged us and has never made teshuvah, yet at some point needs to come to us to get something. Even if we meet the need, during that time, do we have any underlying motivations? Are our actions and words at all colored by that past, that unhealed past? Do we have any schadenfreude? Are we even willing to admit such things? The truth of the Joseph narrative is one that plays out in synagogues, houses of worship, and temples, I would imagine, of pretty much every religion that has an institutional aspect. We assume that we step into them as our most highly elevated selves, but instead, when they're all too often behave based on our earliest and least unhealed psychic injury, on our least developed achievement scale. This dichotomy, when not conscious, when we're not aware of this, can be disastrous. The best boards that I've been on are filled with people that at some level have explored this. Those boards are and have been a gift beyond words. The worst ones are filled with powerful, intelligent, successful people who have never looked in the mirror. Those boards are not exactly a gift. The reason that we become other than our expected best selves when we are in the synagogue should actually be a bit obvious. In our vocation, for example, the most important thing in our job is our ability to do our job, fully taking into account that some jobs are much broader and do require those crossover people skills, but there are also other jobs that require us only to be good at the job, at the vocation, the skill that we have developed over time. And through that, we can achieve high success. A synagogue is a place that crosses tribal relations with communal ritual and spiritual intuition. It functions much closer to a family than a place where we use our vocational skills. So if my experience as a member of a family was that I was the least loved child of 17, or the non-understood black sheep, or God forbid, a victim of abuse, whether I realize it or not, it will not be that high-functioning person from my job who's sitting there with my siddur following along with the prayer service. What it will be is that unloved, unaccepted, or unhealed child. And if this sounds implausible, while at the same time I acknowledge we're probably all starting to feel even slightly more uncomfortable, let us ask ourselves if our conversations that happen in the parking lot after a service, where we just naturally and so automatically step into that moment of cutting down that other member, this board member or other board member, this Gabbai, this rabbi, cantor, or educator. Is this an expression of our most highly evolved selves? Or is this a result of something much more primitive and default? Now let's ask ourselves how ubiquitous this type of conversation is. Now let's ask ourselves how often we are a willing participant in these conversations. Probably worth a bonus question as we thought of one of those conversations that we took part in if we began justifying what it was we said. When you read the Joseph narrative in its entirety, the actions of Joseph from the time that his brothers come begging at his door are incomprehensible through the lens of a hero, through the lens of heroic action. Unless we accept his actions as good and wise simply because they appear in a holy book, and he just happens to be at that moment the central narrative figure in that holy book, the games that he plays with his family are not heroic. They are, however, the utterly heartbreaking and predictable actions of an unhealed, wounded child. He was hurt badly, incomprehensibly. If we just take a moment to really think about what the narrative is saying happened, It's really bad. If we put ourselves in his place in any analogous way, how well do we survive? Not only at that moment, but in who we become in the future. How elevated will our actions be if we once again encounter people who so sought to hurt us? Most likely, we're going to act like Joseph at his worst. And while this is not ideal at an ethical or spiritual level, it's pretty understandable. It's completely expected. It is universal. One might even say it's okay, right up to the moment where we start seeing our actions that we're acting as the wounded child as heroic. The question this week, I think, should be a practical one, even one honestly that you can use as a spiritual meditation in your synagogue board, in your synagogue, in your house of worship, if you've had the blessing and honor to be part of a leadership team outside of your place of vocational high achievement. And it starts with asking ourselves and defining that very achievement. In a culture filled with expectations for false humility, this alone can be brutal. What am I good at? What have I worked at to sharpen my skills? What juxtaposition of these two represents the thing that I most strongly believe I'm bringing to the table? And then we look in the mirror. Wonderful for me as a rabbi if I can lead a compelling service. If that's the case, I should own that. Have I ever admitted to myself, however, how terrified I am when I step into a hospital room? And what does it cost me if I don't admit that to myself? And as congregations honestly expect rabbis to do and be everything, what is it costing the congregation to believe that, or to not understand that these are different skills? If you yourself have a personal expectation, what's it costing you? If I am a brilliant corporate strategist who acquires new businesses and brings them online and into line, do I have the ability to hear the rabbi, cantor, or educator who's burnt out after I have been elected the chair for the board of trustees? Am I willing to listen to that other board member whose leadership style is completely opposite of mine? Hey, if in my corporate world I have the fiat power of Pharaoh, is the consensus building that's required of me in the synagogue something for which I am trained, skilled, and prepared? What happens when I'm not willing to see that the answer to any of these questions is no? Shabbat shalom, everyone. Take care. We'll see you next time.
וקול שופר הריעו לפני המלך אדוני